All right, it is 10 o'clock, so we will get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sean Carroll. I am a senior GIS and environmental resource educator at Cornell Cooperative Extension. Just want to take a minute to thank you all for joining us on your Saturday morning. We have a few people who have weathered the storm. I hope everyone's doing okay. We have few people are joining us without power, so that's dedication. So thank you all for being with us this morning, and hope everyone's doing well. Just a couple introductory housekeeping items. Just wanted to let everyone know. So there is the chat box function for anyone who's not too familiar with Zoom. To get to that, just hover over the toolbar and you'll see the chat function there. So we will be using that for questions. We will have some time, hopefully after presentations and towards the end of the morning to ask specific questions to our presenters, but please feel free to use the chat box informally as well as we go along. This is going to be, kind of an open-ended discussion today. So hope that's a useful tool for you. Also, we are recording this morning's presentation for anyone who wishes to either view it later or share it with someone else who couldn't be here today. I will send that link around to the registration list as well as upload it to our CCEDC website. Great. So yeah, if you haven't already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box just so we know who's here, and you can interact with one another that way. And I also wanted to mention the email. Hopefully everyone received the email from me in the last day or two with a number of documents and resources. There was a short little fun pre-assignment or homework assignment that hopefully people had a chance to look through. If not, that's okay too. But there was also the checklist, which is a really useful tool that we'll be discussing a little bit today, and will hopefully be a good resource for you going forward. And then also in that email is a link to a video recording in which I went through that checklist, kind of demonstrating the use of a number of these tools that we'll be covering today, and how to go through the checklist using them. So hopefully everyone got that email. If not, please let me know and I will send that along to you following today's training so you have all those resources. I do have an evaluation, of course, for our trainings. These evaluations always help us with figuring out, what content we want to provide for you all in future trainings. So I will send that link around at the end of today's training. Please just, if you don't mind, it's pretty short, just take 2 or 3 minutes to fill that out. It's very helpful for us. So I will send that along later on. And I think that covers the kind of housekeeping. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? I would just ask everyone to keep yourselves muted unless you do have a specific question, or later on when we have the discussion period. Otherwise, please just keep yourself muted for out of respect for the presenters. Thank you very much.
Hey, Sean, Paul Andrews. I did get the documents, but it was on my iPad and I switched to my laptop and lost it, whatever it was. But if you could resend it to me, please.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Paul. I'm making a note of that right now. All right. Great. So I just want to take a second to introduce today's presenters. As I mentioned myself, my name is Sean Carroll. I'm with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Dutchess County. We also have joining us today Nate Nardi-Cyrus, who is a conservation and land use specialist with the Hudson River Estuary program in Cornell University. We have Devin Rigolino, who is the Senior GIS Project Coordinator at Dutchess County Department of Planning and Development. And we have Julie Hart, who is the Senior Manager of Stewardship and Education at Dutchess Land Conservancy. And we have a jam-packed morning. I'll give a little bit better introduction to them as we get going. Just want to show you kind of what we're looking at for the morning agenda-wise. So as I mentioned, we'll get started here shortly with just a quick discussion of homework for anyone who may have had a chance to look over that. And then I'll hand it over to Nate, who will give us an overview of the context and importance of open space planning. And Nate will also go over the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, which is an excellent tool that I'm hoping some of you are a little familiar with today, but hopefully become experts with afterwards. Following that, I'll hand it over to Devin, who will give an overview of Dutchess County's parcel access, aerial viewer, and some of their other tools. And then finally, I will hand it over to Julie to give an excellent presentation, kind of going over the history of land use planning and conservation in the region and kind of the importance and how that fits into, hopefully, into the work that you all do every day. And then lastly, we'll do a quick 10-minute breakout group. We'll break it into small groups just to have a discussion and do some networking, just to talk a little bit about how you may use these tools or how you can see yourselves using them in the future. And then lastly, we'll regroup. We'll have a short discussion and we'll have a time for any remaining questions then. Great. So real quickly, just need to give you a quick overview of my organization for anyone who's not familiar. So Cornell Cooperative Extension of Dutchess County is a subordinate governmental agency that's associated with Cornell University and its land grant mission since 1869. We take the research of Cornell University and other land grant universities, interpret that research for the public, and provide research-based resources, tools, and education for the residents and officials of Dutchess County. Our mission is to provide quality educational programs that build strong, healthy youth, adults, families, and communities while enhancing the economic, social, agricultural, and natural resources of Dutchess County. We have 4 program areas. I am part of the Environment and Energy program. And our program is completely funded by contracts, grants, and a bit of foundational support. We currently receive funding from, I think, over 10 different sources. So this allows us to provide a really diverse range of programs on a wide variety of topics, including GIS education and technical resources, flood resilience, climate change, youth outdoor and STEM education, energy efficiency, renewables, water outreach, watershed outreach and education, and a whole host of others. And these programs serve a wide variety of audiences, but our main audience are you all, local municipalities and Dutchess County residents. So we appreciate your support. And then lastly, today's program is one of several trainings and forums that we organize yearly, being funded by Dutchess County to provide education on greenway principles and smart land use policy to our communities. You all might be familiar with some of our others, like our CAC EMC roundtable, which we held earlier in the year. And we also just had a fantastic forum on pollinators, which was organized by my colleague, Michelle Gluck. If anyone missed that and is interested, that's also recorded, and I'd be happy to share that with anyone. So yeah, this funding that we get from the county supports activities like today's training, and also gives us the flexibility to provide administrative support to Dutchess County CACs, the EMC, and local watershed groups in the county, and allows us to respond to basic inquiries from municipalities, institutions, the general public on any greenway related topics, local natural resources, watershed topics, energy use, and climate smart communities. So very grateful to the county for their funding to allow us to provide you guys with this great programmatic work. All right. So with that, we're gonna just do a quick poll. I have a couple questions. So for anyone who's not familiar with the poll function, I'm gonna launch that now. So there's 2 questions. The first one is familiarity with these tools. So the first question here, please rank your familiarity with Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. And then the second, rank your familiarity with Dutchess County Parcel Access or Aerial Viewer, just so we can kind of get a sense of who's using these tools and your familiarity with them before we get going today. So just take a couple minutes to answer those. All right, looks like most people answered that. So let's see. So familiarity with the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. It looks like we have a few people who are somewhat or fairly familiar with it, and also a few who have never even used it. So great. So hopefully this should be educational for a lot of you. And then for Dutchess County parcel access and those tools, looks like we have a good mix of that as well. A few who are pretty familiar and a good mix of those who are fairly unfamiliar. So great. And one more question, just for anyone who did have a chance to look through the short homework exercise. Did you have a chance to? Yes, no, maybe, it's okay. You don't have to be honest. It's just, we're just curious. And then if so, did you learn or discover anything cool on your property? Did you find maybe there was a stream that you weren't aware of, or a wetland, or an important area for rare plants or animals that was interesting to you? So take a second or two to fill that out, please. All right, so I'll end that. And let's see. All right, so a good mix of people a few people were able to do it. Great, thanks. And again, it's not mandatory. It was just kind of a fun exercise to get you all familiar with these tools a little bit. So hope that was useful. And it looks like we had a good mix of things that people discovered on their property, or maybe were aware of, but learned a little bit more about. So great. I'm glad to see that some people got to familiarize themselves with these tools a little bit more. And hopefully after today's training, you'll be much more familiar with it. Excellent. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Nate. Nate, I'll stop my share, and while you're getting set up, I'll just give you a quick introduce you here shortly. So Nate Nardi-Cyrus is a conservation and land use specialist with the Hudson River Estuary Program, where he works with municipalities, land trusts, and other partners to incorporate conservation science into land use planning. He provides education, tools, and assistance to communities and organizations throughout the Estuary Watershed. Before coming to the Estuary Program, Nate conducted natural resources management and conservation easement monitoring for the Scenic Hudson Land Trust. And today, Nate is going to provide some context for open space planning, as well as give an overview of the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. So with that, Nate, I'll turn it on over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Sean. And it's so great to be here and see some familiar names in the box there. As a little introduction to myself, outside of what Sean just said, of course, I work for the Hudson River Estuary Program, and I just want to elaborate that, feel free to contact me anytime. Our contact will be shared, and if you have any specific questions, our job is to be here to help you, including everyone else on this call today. So if you don't know what the Hudson River Estuary Program is, it's a uniquely non-regulatory program of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation through a partnership with Cornell University. And we work to achieve many key benefits that I have shown here on the slide, and really working with communities and land trusts to accomplish this through things like grants, technical assistance, and educational programming. So many of you may be familiar with some of our work. If you're interested, we actually just released a brand new action agenda, which is really our strategic plan. And that's on our website, and I encourage you to look that over to see kind of what our 5-year goals and strategies are going to be going forward. So, I'm kicking off this presentation on mappers and map resources. And the thought came to my mind as, why are natural resources inventories and open space plans, included in this? Like, why are they important in the context of mappers? And I think the good way to think about this kicking off the day today is, if you do have one of these resources, that they should be your go-to resource. This should be the thing that you're going to anytime you want to figure out information at the town level. But also, if you have something like a natural resources inventory, you can often find out specific information about your community. Everyone is really lucky in Dutchess County to have a Dutchess County NRI that's from 2010, and that should be something that you're familiar with and make yourself familiar with. But if you don't have an NRI for your municipality, say, or you are outside of Dutchess County and don't have an NRI, we encourage you to work on your own and to use the data that we're going to learn about today to incorporate it into your analysis of your community. And you may be wondering what a natural resources inventory is, and I will elaborate further on that. So this is, I want to first share kind of an approach that our team uses when we communicate with municipalities and really any organization when they're doing their conservation work. And so the first step for any plan or policy, no matter at what scale, it could be for a property or for a municipality or a region or watershed, is to conduct an inventory. So basically assemble all of the known information on that subject area and provide some kind of interpretation for that. And that's usually quite a process on its own. After all that information is put together, we encourage you to prioritize. So take that information, often combine it with public input or some expert input to make sense of the information and come up with priorities. And then once you have those two pieces in place, you can take that and move forward with planning, protecting, and management. So some of the examples I have here are critical environmental areas. That's one way that a community can, use that information to identify important areas in a more formal way. Creating an open space plan to plan future management into the future, or even site level analysis, particularly looking at planning and zoning boards and their work. They can use those priorities and inventory resources to make the best decisions that they can. So we're going to start out with this inventory process, and I'll say that our program has focused on natural resources inventories, or this basic collection of data, since about 2014, because it is this kind of critical foundation for all other future planning. And so since that time, we've had about 40 NRI projects throughout this region. It's getting pretty impressive looking at this map. And if we focus in on Dutchess County here, we see that there's some recently completed NRIs in the towns of Unionvale and Poughkeepsie, in Beekman. The city of Beacon just finished their NRI in the city of Poughkeepsie. And then we have some in progress in Rhinebeck, Hyde Park, and Poughkeepsie. So a lot of representation on the call today. It's good to see a lot of you that I've worked with in the past or am working with now to do these kind of projects. And I really had to share this information because we just released our new grant announcement through our program, and we're funding a lot more NRIs in the region. And particularly, what's really exciting is that the entire county, led by Sean Carroll and county planning in this case, is going to be doing an update to the 2010 NRI in the coming years. So that's going to be really helpful for everyone, even if you don't see yourself on this list of municipalities that have an NRI through our program. I will say some other municipalities here probably do have NRIs that aren't listed, but at least that information will be available at the county level. And also, if you're lucky enough to live in Milan, they also got a grant to do an NRI as well. So really excited to be working on these projects going into the future. Talked enough about what the importance of NRIs, but what is it actually? So it's really, like as I said before, a combination or a amalgamation of all the known information that a community has on things like geology, water resources, habitat, agriculture, cultural resources, climate change, really anything that has to do with the landscape and natural resources, though as you can see here, cultural resources sometimes come into play. And that should include a series of maps. I don't know if I have that in this slide, but it should include a series of maps that describe that data spatially, and then a descriptive report and appendices that give context for those maps so that they're not just floating out in space. They're actually easy to interpret. To move my panel here. So why inventory natural resources? I think we all kind of intuitively know the answer to this question. But one specific reason is to educate landowners and developers. This is kind of an easy thing that's not controversial. When people come before the planning board, it's really helpful to provide them information on the natural resources in the community, so that projects are well thought out before they even come into the planning process. And landowners just like to know about their lands. As an example, I know I live in the town of Rosendale in Ulster County, and I definitely consulted the NRI before moving to that town and learned quite a bit about my property prior to even buying the house. It can be a reference for the land use planners themselves. So planning boards, zoning boards, CACs or environmental boards that, assist planning boards with these types of projects. But it also can be used by land trusts and other nonprofit organizations as, just a general resource, especially when that data is described. So a land trust may have a lot of this data on hand, but they're not necessarily sure what the community priorities are, or maybe there's a report in the appendix of the NRI that they weren't aware of. So it brings all that information together so that it's all easily accessible. Helps look at the big picture. We've been doing a lot of natural resources inventories projects with intermunicipally. So I will say a lot of the work in Dutchess that we've done has been with Sean Carroll. It's been really a great partnership working with Dutchess CCE on these projects, and in working with especially starting with Beekman and Unionvale, looking at these resources as they cross borders and seeing the importance of their forest resources and how connected they are. It's really just a great way to kind of visualize the landscape. And we're doing the same thing right now in Rhinebeck and Hyde Park, and it's been really exciting and fun. And as I said before, it's a foundation for comprehensive planning, zoning updates, and open space planning. I can wax poetic about all this stuff so long, so I need to be mindful of my time. Where do I find the data? Yeah, that's a big question, right? So how do you populate these NRIs with good information, with relevant information? And so this kind of brings it back to the idea of mappers, right? Their collections of information. This is the Woodstock NRI and one of their wonderful maps here, and they chose to use this data partially because it was also available on the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, really similar looking to this exact map, even color scheme wise. So I encourage you to think about all the resources for in not only the Natural Resource Mapper, but also in the Dutchess County mappers, and think about if you do want to do an NRI or an update, these are great places to look for new data because it's often posted on an annual basis even. This is just an example of a recent NRI in Montgomery, which is in Orange County. So they get their series of maps, their reports, and they adopted that via resolution and through their comp plan to really incorporate it into their planning process. And then they ultimately are using that now, putting it into action, moving it from an inventory to an action by creating a critical environmental area. And here you can see they took information on aquifers from their NRI, and they used those exact boundaries with some slight modifications to create a critical environmental area, which is basically a tool of Seeker that highlights areas of importance in the community during certain types of land use review. So really, it's a jumping board for doing further policy actions like this. Okay, the next step in this kind of process is to prioritize. And an example of a prioritization is, oh, did I lose my, did I miss this? Nope, is starting with a natural resources inventory and going into an open areas inventory and map, which can become an open space index. And I don't want you to get caught up in the semantics because there's a lot of legislative authority behind all this stuff, and it can get kind of complicated. But really what this is just a prioritization, taking the NRI and prioritizing specific parcels for acquisition based on what resources and what community input goes into that. And that ultimately is something that CACs are tasked with doing. And it basically becomes the expression of the community's commitment to open space. It helps them articulate what the priorities are. And so I just want to give you a quick example of this. The town of Phillipstown, they had a natural resources inventory. They had a public input and review process. And then ultimately they ended up with this kind of map of prioritized parcels. So you can see the data from the NRI went in and some public input, and then they ended up with these priorities. And you might think, well, why is this important? At the end of the day, Phillipstown doesn't have a pot of money to spend on land. So their priorities, what do they matter? Well, the town adopted it, so it became their formal village. There was a lot of press. There was a lot of interest in what that And what that meant, the planning board understood, the environmental board understood that this was a major priority, especially in this area up here. This is their #1 priority for the town. It really shows up in a big way. And so that kind of sets the backdrop for years later when Scenic Hudson came in and purchased the land around Lake Valhalla, which is that property. And, you can see that a lot of the press around it, the property was the #1 priority in the open space plan prepared by Phillipstown in the open space inventory, which was a part of that plan. And really, it's the building of support for these projects that help our land trust partners to gain support, to gain donations. So really identifying these parcels, while the town might not be able to buy the properties, sometimes they can, but oftentimes they can't. It helps to build support and ultimately catalyze action through other partnerships. And finally, we end at planning and management. And, an open space plan is, one of those things that it provides, priorities, justification, and strategy for conservation. And it often isn't as specific as an open space inventory. It can be, it can have specific parcels, but it's more about the strategy, the broad priorities. So maybe like large nondescript areas. So it really just sets the vision for the future of that community. And like I said, it can help build relationships. It helps increase municipal capacity because of just the way that the big nature of these projects and how public input kind of helps connect people in the community to these types of priorities. It creates a foundational planning tool and starts dialogue on, adaptation and other important things in our communities. And, this can be said for NRIs and open space inventories. Any kind of planning project can accomplish these things. And I want to leave you with this exciting example from the city of Kingston. They've been really progressive on this front, and they created a natural resources inventory that they ultimately used to create this plan, which includes a prioritization. You can see here these kind of priority conservation areas, and it's really neat how they did this and visualized it and articulated their goals. But they've actually, they only released this plan a few years ago, but they've already made serious progress in achieving this. So they've, just 2 years ago acquired this about 10 or 15 acre quarry as a part of the Rondout Uplands area, which is considered a priority, and it harbors rare bat species. They just recently accomplished this goal. 500 acres were preserved here. That's set to be the Hudson Cliffs State Park. Scenic Hudson purchased that property. And they also purchased a property within this kind of urban conservation area that was the African Burial Ground project, which I encourage you to look up. It's very interesting, on Pine Street in Kingston. And there's already drawings and schematics, and the property's been conserved. How am I doing on time here, Sean? That was my first presentation.
Doing great, Nate. Doing fine.
Okay. I'm kind of speeding through this.
No need to rush. You're doing fine.
Okay, great. But I do have a lot to cover in the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. So what I'm going to do is, if you do have questions, continue to post them in the chat box, and Sean can get those to me at the end of my next presentation, because there's quite a lot of information to talk about in the mapper here.
Sounds good, Nate. Thanks.
Yep. So the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, it was great to see that poll and understand that a lot of people aren't familiar with this. It's a very easy to use mapper that's hosted through the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. You'll notice if you ever use the Environmental Resource Mapper, it's extremely similar visually to it, but it is not the same. That mapper is used to establish kind of regulatory authority in a lot of cases. This is strictly a planning tool, and there's plenty of reminders of that throughout when you're kind of logging on to the mapper itself. And I'll talk about that in a second. But it really includes 30 plus geographic data sets on these broad categories. This is something that our program helps to maintain. And we are, as a part of what the Estuary program does, is we develop these kind of specific geographic data sets for municipalities through partnerships, often through the New York Natural Heritage Program. And so then we try to share that information on the mapper. So it's constantly being updated with kind of new data products and new interpretation of that. So if you've seen this presentation before, I feel like there's always something a little new to talk about here. Again, the goals are to provide access to all of this information in an easy use tool. The Hudson Valley is really lucky to have a lot of valley specific data that isn't available statewide. And so this is a place for it to live and for people in this region to use it. And it helps to visualize context and interconnectedness of resources. Even if your community has something like a natural resources inventory, if it's of any age, it probably isn't associated with a web mapper. And the fact that, and these mappers are dynamic, you can zoom in, you can zoom out. It allows you to kind of visualize the connectedness of things, especially forests in our landscape. And I'll talk quite a bit about that in just a little bit. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a just kind of tutorial. I'm going to run through it pretty fast because Sean did a good job of running through the checklist. But if you type in Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper in Google, this is the first place it'll bring you to. It'll bring you this landing page here. So let me try to get my cursor active again. So there's this little link to launch the mapper, but there's plenty of information on this landing page. There's a fact sheet that is a 2-pager that kind of you could share with colleagues or friends that can get them started on using the mapper and provide you a little bit of a cheat sheet. There is a webinar recording. This is actually an older screenshot. We have an updated recording from, I believe, 2019 or 2020 that shows, really gets in depth. It's like about an hour long of just looking at this tool. So if this isn't enough, it just whets your appetite, there is a recording on this main page. So when you click on that mapper link, you're brought to this disclaimer box, and it really just reminds you that this is not a regulatory tool. It's for planning, it's for land use decision making. So be aware of that. There are immediately instructions available, and you'll see that throughout this tool. There's always a place to click on if you feel lost and alone and need a little bit of technical backup. So when you click on that, you'll come to this PDF, and it helps you gives you a step-by-step and a reminder of a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so let's open the map together. And the first thing that we do is we arrive at the mapper itself. And we always recommend that people go to this little box up here, full screen, just so you can actually get a good extent. It gets very difficult to see the data, especially in the left-hand side here, when that is minimized. So you can see this blue line is the Hudson River Estuary Watershed. So all of the water that drains into the tidal portion of the Hudson River is highlighted here, and that's what a lot of this data focuses on. To get to the data itself, there's this kind of expandable accordion tab system where if you click on Hudson River Estuary layers right here, the tab will expand and you can scroll using this bar. You can also zoom in and out, again, very similar to Google Maps, but I can't promise that it's quite as intuitive as that. As I said, you're never far from instructions. Those are in the very top corner of the map here. So we're going to go through a little bit of a kind of orientation exercise, very short. If you wanted to go to, say, Norrie Point, right? That's in Dutchess County, and a place that our program uses for our educational programming on the river. Type in Norrie Point, and we have to click where it shows up here. So you can search by location, but you don't have to search that way. So we're going to just click here at the place names. Like I said before, if you have an address, you would click address here and then type in the address. This is where it's not as easy as Google. It's not that smart. You have to kind of click what you're going to be typing in and then type it in. So this box tells you where you are. You can zoom in and out, and that box will still stay there so that you're still kind of focused on the same area. You can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out backwards and forwards. That can be really useful. Or you can shift and drag a box, and that will center you on where you need to be. If you click home, it'll zoom you all the way out to the estuary extent, but you still have that little marker there letting you know where you are. And then you can also change the base map. So we've been looking at this kind of topographic layer with road maps. If you go to the top here, you get this whole list of things that you can choose from. So I encourage you to play around with that. But we're going to look at the New York State aerials. And so this is Ortho imagery where, these are aerial images that were taken in spring of this year, not this year, but spring of the year that they were taken. And this is actually automatically updated to the most recent version by default in this mapper. And if you clear this, that little box goes away, just in case you don't want it there. You can actually print these maps, so you may not want that. This is the tools function where you can actually get to doing measure. So you can measure distances between objects in a very kind of, I don't want to say imprecise, but it's not like a GIS if you have access to that. But it can give you an idea of distance between objects. And you can also print. Gives you, options to print, and then there you go right here. I will say, unfortunately, one of the limitations of this tool is that it doesn't produce a legend, and that's something we've been trying to work on and still unable to accomplish that. So if you're doing a map, I do suggest that you keep it really, really simple enough to be able to interpret. Honestly, it's probably best to just have a title that is essentially the legend. Say this is just say aerial image of Nori Point, or if there's DEC regulated streams, put DEC regulated streams of Nori Point, because you're not going to have any opportunity to put a legend in this. Okay, so back at our home screen again. Just a reminder that the layers become visible at different scales, and if they're in kind of this gray italics, it's not showing up now, but you'll notice it, then that layer can't display because it's at the wrong scale. So zooming in and out should get you eventually to this black text, which means that the layer is in fact visible. I recommend not using the turn on all layers in the group. While that might seem like an attractive option, it really overloads the mapper and you can slow down the whole thing. So please refrain from doing that. We actually, in a recent update, have a new little button that's right here where Ithaca is on this map that actually, it's like a go back symbol, and it'll clear all the layers. So that's something that we had been asked for in the past. And so now you can actually go and clear the layers if you are getting bogged down by a lot of information that's been clicked on. So we rather encourage you to customize your layer selection by clicking individually on the layers and scrolling down through to make sure that you see all the layers. This is a really important point. Next to each piece of data here, there's an information tab. And so if you click on that, you'll get to some good descriptive data or some good descriptive information that describes that data and gives you the place to download it. So if you are a GIS user, you can figure out how to get to where that information is. If you're not, you can at least understand what the data is exactly and how to interpret it. As someone who does use GIS on a regular basis, I love the Natural Resource Mapper because our GIS at the DEC is very slow. And if you really just need to kind of go on for a quick second and look at some data from one of the sources that we have, it makes it very fast and easy. So I know a lot of professionals that use it in that way as well, even though they have access to kind of more powerful GIS tools. Okay, so before I kind of jump into the data, there's a lot. So I'm going to take a deep breath. We can all take a deep breath. If you don't remember it, that's okay. We're going to have this information recorded. There's plenty of ways to look up more about these data. Like I said, the information tabs are going to be really important. This is just to show you the breadth of information that's available and the types of things that might pique your interest to explore later. So don't get overwhelmed. I know that it can sometimes, bring you to those places. Okay, so the first data set I'm going to preview is the Estuary Watershed. So this provides information on tidal wetlands, submerged aquatic vegetation, which just basically means underwater vegetation in the Hudson, migratory fish runs, significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat, and bathymetry, which is the mapped surface of under the Hudson. So it can give you depths of the Hudson. Okay, so the first thing I've clicked on is tidal wetlands. This is some really high resolution mapping that was done by the Hudson River Estuary Research Reserve. And if you click on these wetland areas, it'll give you information on the acreage and the type of wetland that it is, but there's also a little bit of a key here. Like I said, a legend isn't shown where you're printed, but this is your default legend while you're viewing the mapper. The New York State Department of State has their coastal fish and wildlife habitats, and that's those are really great primary sources if you're at all looking at river habitats. So if you click on any of them, it'll tell you what that habitat is, it'll tell you the region, which of course is going to be the Hudson River, and then you can click on these links. And you'll see throughout that anytime you click on a feature on the mapper, there's usually links that bring you to more information. So in addition to this I button, you can also click on links and go as deep as you want into these things. I'll also note that you can see kind of underneath this DOS coastal fish and wildlife habitat layer, you can see those wetlands that we just looked at before. And so these arrow buttons allow you to kind of click through everything that's underneath this top layer. So if you click next, you would see wetlands would show up and you can see that habitat as well. So in this case, I'm going to click to this external report and it brings you right to the DOS site and you can look up that report there and you can find that information. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. There are some estuary communities here, and I encourage you to explore that more when you have a chance. We have a lot of stream layers. I'm not going to name them all, but I am going to discuss a couple of them right now. So the first one I'm going to look at, a good Dutchess County example. This is the Fallkill watershed. It's the HUC 12 watershed, which is short for hydrologic unit code. And that really is the smallest level watershed that we have available on the mapper. These watersheds, as you probably know, is just all of the area that feeds into a given stream. So in this case, all the area that drains into the Fallkill is represented by this blue line here. If you click on that, it'll actually give you information about that watershed. So here we have canopy cover from 2016 and 2011. Those were calculated and shown here. We also have impervious cover, and those can be kind of proxy measures for watershed health and for stream health. And in this case, you can see that actually there was a reduction in canopy cover and an increase in impervious cover. So as canopy cover decreases, watershed health generally also decreases. As impervious cover increases, watershed health decreases. So in this case, it may be even the case that, canopy was cleared and impervious cover replaced it. It almost looks like that might be the case here. Zooming out a little bit, here's that watershed for some context, the Fallkill watershed. You can see the DEC classifications and trout status. And so this is really the regulatory authority of the DEC through their protection of waters law that regulates stream activity in certain streams. But we did change it so that you can see this dark purple color. That's a known trout stream. So while the DEC regulatory authority doesn't necessarily show water quality, knowing where the areas that are considered to be trout habitat is another proxy for watershed quality, because trout need kind of high quality streams, cold water, high oxygen levels, shaded, and those are generally higher health streams. So you can see that on the map here. And you can click on those to get the actual DEC regulatory status of each segment. The priority water body list goes along with that, and it's basically an assessment by DEC as to if the stream is meeting its goals as far as water quality goes. And you can see that the Fallkill is not meeting those goals and is considered to be impaired. And this is a great example of where you can click on this fact sheet here, and it'll bring you to the reasons why it's impaired. So this is a report that's produced by DEC that talks about the health of that stream there. Next, we have the FEMA flood hazard data. I'm not going to go into that a lot because that's also available on the parcel mapper. But you'll see here this blue, kind of light colored blue, that's a product that the New York Natural Heritage Program developed for our Trees for Tributaries program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So Trees for Tribs provides plants and technical assistance to streamside landowners in the region. And they wanted to know where the best areas to reforest would be for their program. So this data was created by modeling the 50-year floodplain. So in the FEMA data, you might be familiar with the 100-year or 500-year floodplain. The 50-year floodplain is a much smaller storm. So that was modeled, and then adjacent wetlands to that area because those are going to be contributing a lot to stream quality and health. So this is a great indication not only of where you might want to reforest in your community, but also an indication of potential flood hazards outside of FEMA data, because this covers a lot more stream length than the FEMA data, which usually looks at larger size streams. Okay, looking at wetlands, we have on here the DEC regulatory wetlands, those are only wetlands greater than 12.4 acres in size. So they're really limited in what they show here. And this also has this regulated or this wetland check zone. That's not the regulatory authority of the DC. What that's basically saying is that these maps are so inaccurate that we need to go out 500 feet from the edge just to confirm if you're in that check zone, the map might just be wrong. So that's all that that's really saying, even though the DC does regulate 100 feet away from known wetland areas. Next, we have a little bit more detail. This is the National Wetlands Inventory produced by the Fish and Wildlife Service. I want to remind people that this is actually not the regulatory authority of the Army Corps of Engineers who regulate federal wetlands. This is just a product put out by the federal government to map wetlands remotely. And it definitely shows a lot more than what you saw on the DC regulatory wetlands if I toggle between the two, but it is still underrepresents small and drier wetlands. So we have this wetland soil data. This is hydric soils, so soils that are considered to be wetland soils, but it was mapped at a very coarse resolution, about 2 acres is the unit size. So this is not saying that there's this many wetlands in the landscape, but if you have a project before you that has one of these possible or probable wetland areas, it's a good flag for you to ask a consultant or have one of your field staff go check it out and explore, because there may be wetland areas there that are unmapped. Okay, this is the area that I'm interested in, a lot of the forest products. And so we're going to look at it in the context of a specific location. This is near my home in Ulster County, looking primarily at the town of Esopus here. And the first thing we're going to look at is the Forest Condition Index. This is a pretty new product that our program developed in partnership with New York Natural Heritage Program. And it basically, what it did was it divided all the forests in the Hudson Valley region into individual patches. And those patches are separated primarily by roads, but by things like large rivers as well. They're also separated by power line, utility corridors, agricultural land, development, things like that. And so you got this huge list of specific parts or patches rather of forest land. And then they were all assessed on their quality based on the presence of rare species, the connectedness of them, whether or not they were in a wildlife corridor or not. Are there wetlands, streams in them? Is there a lot of fragmentation in them? Were the forests, broken up in a way that makes them less biologically intact? And so there was about 20 to 30 different things that were looked at. Carbon sequestration was one of them as well. And so every patch was assigned a score, and then they were all ranked against each other, kind of like your third grader who might, be in the 1% of their class if you're lucky. In this case, there are in fact 1 percentile forests, and those are primarily in the Catskills. I believe there's one in the Shawangum Mountains, and then some of the Taconics are considered that as well. So we get an idea of kind of the priority forests in our area based on this. So in this case, if we click on this big forest patch, it'll actually tell us some information. So this is in the 96th.8 percentile, so one of the most important forests in the Hudson Valley, but it also gives you some rankings. So this forest is in the top 1% for connectedness, habitat diversity, and 5% for patch size. So you get an idea of why this forest is important as well. And we also have in conjunction a core forest layer. So this is really just indicating the areas far enough away from roads and human development that are the most considered to be likely the most intact parts of that forest. So, in conjunction, these two layers give you a really good idea of the most important forest areas. Now I want to compare this to the forest linkage zones. So these are the broader data set created by the Nature Conservancy and the Heritage Program. And it has these areas that were identified as important forest hubs, essentially, forest matrix blocks. And so you see the Catskills here. This is Esopus, and this is the area we were just looking at. So if you, like I said, zoom way out in the mapper, you can see how that forest not only is important at the local level, but you can see why it's important at that regional connection level. It's really connecting the Catskills through the Shawangums over and up to the Taconics. So it's a really critical connection point there. And I think that I find that always interests people. I know it interests me. Okay, one of the last major layers I'll talk about is the biodiversity. So the first layer that we have is the significant biodiversity areas, and that was basically created through the Wildlife and Habitat Conservation Framework that our program helped create. I believe that was in 2006. And this was basically a vetted list by experts and using data to identify areas that had the highest biodiversity in the region. So we have those mapped, and there's plenty more information on them in this report that is linked to if you click on one of these areas. We have Audubon important bird areas. That's in the pink color here, and there's quite a few of those in our region. You can click on those and it'll bring you right to the page that describes that. And then we have our important areas data set. And I hope I'm not losing people because I've talked about a lot of data so far, but all I'll say is that we were able to, if you haven't accessed this in a while, important areas are areas where there's been a known species documented, so a known rare species. And instead of just drawing a bubble around that species and saying we want to protect all the area around it, this was put into a model that basically looked at habitat across the area and said, what's the most important area for this rare species, what habitat is actually going to help this species. So if there's a city right next to a natural area that has a rare species and the city doesn't provide habitat, that'll be cut out to the model. You can see that kind of here in this hole that's in this larger kind of donut shape. And we also broke it out not by specific animals because there's some sensitivity with that, but you can see that this brown area is terrestrial animals. Migratory fish are important here. That's primarily looking at American eel. Wetland animals, things like, wetland birds and things like turtles. Rare plants, they're all kind of jumbled together into one model. Bat foraging areas, so areas that are important to rare and declining bat species. And if you want more information than what's available here, you can make a formal request to the New York Natural Heritage Program, and they will tell you what species that's being modeled on. So you'll know exactly, which terrestrial animal or which migratory fish that they're basing that information on, and that can hopefully help in your decision making. There's also significant natural communities. That gives you more information. You can actually see that this is a red maple hardwood swamp. If you click on it, it'll tell you the acreage and it'll bring you to the Heritage Program website for more information on that habitat. Okay, not going to talk about this too much other than to say that it's available. DEC land, state parks, SASs, scenic areas of statewide significance along the Hudson. And the last thing is references. So this is kind of, you can have municipal boundaries, tax parcels, critical environmental areas are a new thing that we've added. I kind of brought that up at the beginning of my presentation. And so that's at the very bottom. You can click on any of that stuff. I saw a comment in the chat box saying, asking if the New York Protected Areas database, if those were Dutchess land Conservancy properties, you can actually click on them here and see who the property manager is for an easement. It won't give you the property owner, but it'll tell you who is managing that easement. Okay, and I'll leave, we have this troubleshooting tips. I'm not going to go through these, but I will share my presentation at the end of this. So if you are interested in some tips, they're right here. And that is all I had. So hopefully I'm still in time and may or may not have time for questions. Thank you.
Oh, you did great, Nate. Thanks. That's a lot of information to come in, and we still have about 5 or 7 minutes. So we have a good amount of time for some questions. So that's great.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm just going to go back. We'll just kind of go down in order that I got them. So one question that we received, kind of overarching question, what is the accuracy of these maps? Since I suspect many of them are done through remote sensing. For example, if drilled down and see that our local highway department is draining stormwater directly into a sensitive wetland, can I trust that information? I don't know if you can touch on that, Nate.
Yeah, if we're talking broadly, each of these data sets were created at a different scale. And because most of this data is regional and not town specific, it's probably not the most accurate thing you're looking at. No matter what information, especially for things like wetlands and streams, you're going to want to field verify anything that you see. And you're going to want to, if you do bring it up and flag it in a review, you're going to want to make that caveat that these are done at a regional, in some cases national scale, and that, basically it's just flagging potential issues for further investigation. That's probably the best application of these tools. If you have an NRI, you may have town-specific data that was created at a much finer resolution. So as an example is you may have the town of Beekman has a Hudsonia habitat map. And so they can use that to get a little bit more accuracy and probably say a little bit more about the wetlands in their community.
Great. Yeah, and that's a really good actually segue into the next question. So someone else asked kind of about the difference between county level NRIs and town level NRIs. Devin did kind of give a good overview of that, but this person also went on to ask, is there a difference between an NRI and the Hudsonia habitat maps? And you talked about that a little bit, but you could just clarify that a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. So the NRI is much broader in the scope of what it's covering. So the Hudsonia habitat map will give a little bit of context for the geology, but after that, it's looking at those habitats in extreme detail. So it's a great companion document to a natural resources inventory. It's great to be used as data in an NRI. But things like, regulatory authority of the DEC, that's not going to be shown. Cultural resources won't be shown. Superficial geology might not be shown. So there's a lot of things that, don't fall under that habitat definition that can be included in the NRI, because you really want it to be every piece of environmental information for your town. You want that to be just in that document.
Right. And Tom, hopefully that answered your question a little bit too. He just asked, how do the Hudsonia maps fit into an NRI, another resource? So yeah, that's how they would fit in.
And I'll to add a little bit to that, in the projects that we've worked on with Sean, again, let's say bringing up, let's say Rhinebeck, because that's a new community. They have a Hudsonia habitat map. And so Sean was able to use their streams information because it's of higher resolution than the National Hydrography data set, which is available to everyone. So, that some of the specific information like wetlands and streams can kind of inform all of the maps in the NRI.
Right. And then another question. So it says, much emphasis on the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper not being regulatory. The question is, where is the info that is regulatory? How do I find that kind of information?
Yes, that is available on the Environmental Resource Mapper, which is put out by DEC. And so that's the trusted source of where to establish that regulatory authority. So I can share that in the chat link afterwards, and the EAF mapper, which is used to fill out an environmental assessment form through Seeker. So I can share that after I get off, unless you want to, Sean.
No, that's fine, Nate. If you could do that, that'd be great. Thank you. Yep. And then lastly, just a comment saying the New York Natural Heritage Program constantly struggles to make protected area database accurate and complete. It has a long way to go. Public support for their efforts from towns would really help them to do this important work. So just a good point there. Yeah,
and an exciting addition to that is that they actually were funded to do a new update to that, and they're in the process. It's almost complete, the latest version, and it's going to be providing a lot more detail in the types of ownership. I think they're even getting, in some cases, I heard, down to the goal, like looking at conservation easements and talking about why that conservation easement was put into place. So you could parse out a scenic easement versus a ecological versus an agricultural easement. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be a really exciting update, and it should include a lot more protected lands that are currently seen today.
Fantastic. Well, Nate, thank you so much. If there are any other questions for Nate, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. I'm sure he'll be checking those out as we go along, and we will have a few minutes, about 10 minutes towards the end for any overarching questions. So, Nate, thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you, Sean.
Absolutely. All right. So with that, we'll turn it over to Devin. Devin, while you're getting set up there, I'll just introduce you. So Devin Rigolino is the Senior GIS Project Coordinator for the Dutchess County Department of Planning and Development. He has spent the last decade working within the fields of natural resources management and environmental planning, serving in various roles at conservation organizations and local governments. In his current position, he oversees mapping and spatial analysis projects that support county priorities, such as those focused on land use planning, housing, economic development, and public health. Devin earned his master's degree in natural resources with an emphasis in sustainability from the University of Vermont. Today, Devin is going to give an overview of Dutchess County Parcel Access, Aerial Viewer, and a few other of Dutchess County's mapping applications. So with that, Devin, I will turn it on over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sean. Everyone can see my slides now and hear me?
Yep, looks great and
Great.
loud and clear.
All right, great. So yeah, thank you, Sean, and thanks again to Nate for his great presentation. To echo my co-presenters, I also want to thank all of you for joining us today. Sean said, my name is Devin Rigolino, the County Senior GIS Project Coordinator. And we are really fortunate here in Dutchess County to have such a robust GIS program that crosses many departments. And as a part of our GIS program, we offer several free online mapping applications that anyone can use to make more informed planning decisions. And I'm going to take the next 20 minutes or so to review several of them with you. I'm going to start off with a more general description of these applications, and then towards the end of my time, I'm going to actually power a few of them up and do a live run-through demonstration. So before we dive straight into the county's GIS applications, I, of course, want to give a first brief introduction to the Department of Planning and Development for anyone who hasn't interacted with us before. Our department provides countywide planning services, coordination of economic development projects, comprehensive mapping assistance, and GIS data management to residents, businesses, and county local governments. In New York State, the municipal home rule law gives most regulatory power to local municipalities, meaning that counties actually have very limited regulatory authority. And therefore, one of our department's primary roles is to offer educational opportunities and to serve as a consultant to municipalities so that they're better positioned to execute their work. We have trained planners, GIS staff, and community development professionals that are here to work with municipalities by providing planning and mapping consultation services and by reviewing project referrals, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. So all that's just to say that municipalities are really encouraged to lean on the county's expertise and resources when considering large land use planning and zoning projects. I'm going to be talking a lot about GIS during this presentation. So for those of you who may not know a lot about what GIS is, or maybe have never even heard of that term, GIS is an acronym that stands for Geographic Information Systems. And a geographic information system is a way of managing and studying data that is tethered to spatial locations. So by allowing data to be visualized spatially through maps, greater connections and patterns can be discovered, which enables organizations, businesses, and governments all around the world to solve really complex problems and make decisions that are more informed, more efficient, and more transparent. At the county, we're using GIS each and every day in a variety of ways. We analyze and manage data like addresses that our 911 computer-aided dispatch system in the emergency response department uses. We use GIS data to create zoning districts on behalf of municipalities that don't have their own GIS staff. And we also use GIS to manage tax parcel data in the real property services department, and in a variety of other ways. And in addition to how we use GIS internally, GIS is also in the forefront of our work via several map-based applications that the county hosts on its website. So the county's website is pretty robust. It can be a lot to navigate through just because there is so much information that covers so many different departments and topics. So I wanted to make it clear how you access the county's mapping applications. All of our mapping applications can be found at the county's GIS Connection Hub, which you can reach by Googling Dutchess County GIS, or if you open up our general county website and you type in GIS in the search window at the top of the page, that'll also bring you to our GIS applications page. And of course, if you have the direct link, which is displayed here at the top of my slide, you can also type that directly into your web browser as well. So this is what the county's GIS website landing page looks like. Currently, there are 10 different applications that are available for the public to use, 3 of which you can see here: our Parks and Trails site, Parcel Access, and Address Info Finder. We also have several new applications in the hopper that will be released over the next few years. And we create and update these applications based on feedback from staff, from partner organizations, and from the public. So if there is something that you think that could be really handy to have as a mapping application, let us know. And we always value feedback on our mapping services that can help improve the quality of the services we deliver. One of the new mapping applications that we are going to be working on over the next few years is actually a Dutchess County Natural Resource Inventory Mapper, which will be a part of the county NRI project that Nate mentioned earlier. This new mapping application will include a lot of the data that the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper offers, but it'll be Dutchess specific. And we are really excited about this new tool, which you can expect to launch sometime in the later half of 2023. Okay, so we're going to take a deeper dive into several of these applications, and let's first take a minute to have a closer look at parcel access. From the results of the earlier poll that you all took, it looks like about half of you are already familiar with our parcel access website, which is fantastic. But for those of you who aren't as familiar, parcel access is the county's most utilized web application. It's been accessed more than 154 million times since first launching in 2014. This is a type of GIS that takes real property data and displays it in an interactive format for the public to consume. The spatial data that is displayed here is a product of how the Real Property Tax Service Agency records and inventories where property and municipal boundaries are located. So if you have a parcel's lot number, a parcel's owner, or address, you can quickly locate the parcel, and you can see a list of attributes, including full parcel number, address, owner name, parcel size, school district. All you have to do is type the property information in the upper right-hand corner, and then you would click go, and the map will zoom to the location of the property, and the parcel details will display along the right-hand side of your screen. In addition to property and municipal boundaries, parcel access also has several built-in overlays and tools to help users better understand an area. You can turn on wetland and flood layers. You can even gain a basic understanding of topography by using the terrain base map, which includes 5-foot contour lines overlaid on a hillshade base map. You can use some simple tools to measure distances or areas, and you can print an area of interest in a cleaner output than a typical screenshot would show. And I'll demonstrate many of these features in just a few minutes. Parcel access also presents easy access to any associated documents with a parcel, such as filed survey maps or well reports, if we happen to have those in our records. And something to keep in mind when using parcel access is that our parcel updates are uploaded to the application 2 times per year. And this is just based on the release of the annual tentative assessment rolls on May 1st and the final assessment rolls on July 1st of each year. So I bring that up because if a property that you're interested in was recently sold, merged, subdivided, which can mean a new parcel number or address was assigned, that data might not reflect those changes immediately if they were very recently done. Next up, I want to briefly talk about the county's county's referral identifier tool. This is a useful tool not only for conservation planning, but for any planning project that a municipality might be involved with. So when private or municipal actions involve zoning, or if a project falls within the buffers of certain legislated geographic features, under New York State General Municipal Law, the action must be referred to Dutchess County Planning for review. The referral identifier tool helps municipalities identify which actions to refer and which do not require county input based on their location. So this application does this by displaying the county's jurisdictional determinants layers. These layers we create and manage within the GIS division of the department, and they are made up of various sized buffers that surround a variety of features, including county and state roads, agricultural districts, municipal lines, county, certain government-owned structures, and recreational lands. If you zoom in close enough within this application, lot lines will appear. And if you select a lot that triggers one of those jurisdictional determinant buffers, a list of zoning referral forms will appear, and those can be downloaded as PDFs. So when thinking about conservation planning, projects that are on or are in close proximity to agricultural districts and government-owned lands like parks and conservation areas, those projects would be referred to the county planning department, and our staff here would particularly be interested in considering any potential impacts of those projects to those natural and agricultural resources during their review. Moving on, our aerial viewer application is a favorite for many users because it's just a fascinating tool to see how the county has changed and evolved over time. This is the county's second most utilized application, opened over 37 million times, and it has the most recent aerial imagery that was captured in 2020, as well as imagery as old as 1936, which is really incredible. When we collect aerial imagery, we actually hire a company to fly a plane over the county that has a camera mounted underneath. And this camera captures photographs as it goes, and then those individual images are stitched together and georeferenced to create this continuous base map. We collect aerials every 2 to 5 years. So over time, you'll see additional layers added into this application. You'll also notice that after each year, you'll see an abbreviation that says BW, TC, or CIR. BW stands for black and white, which applies to our older imagery, of course. And you're seeing an example of that right now, our 1980 imagery. And then TC stands for true color, and CIR stands for color infrared. There are many benefits to having the county collect its own aerial imagery, one of which is that when for example, a company like Google is collecting aerials across the entire globe, they don't necessarily always align their capture dates with the local seasons. So sometimes their images will be taken in the middle of summer when the leaves are on the trees and much of the ground is obscured, whereas our images are coordinated to be captured in late winter or early spring to ensure optimum ground clarity. Okay. So the Historic Resource Survey is another great application. Every blue icon that you see here represents a location of a site that has been evaluated to have some historic significance. And by historic significance, that could just mean that there are structures on that property that date back to more than 100 years old. The orange icons indicate areas that have been evaluated to have some scenic viewpoint. And one really important thing that I just want to mention and stress about this historic resource survey is that just because a site is listed on this survey does not necessarily mean that it is a part of the state's historic register. Several historic sites that are on the register are found on this survey, but not all are. This is really just meant to be a local inventory. If you click on any one of these blue dots, a downloadable PDF will pop up, and that's available for you to see the original notes that were taken regarding the property when the survey was first done in the mid-80s, and then any photos that we have of the original structures there as well to get a better understanding of the historic nature of the site. And then very quickly, Info Access is an application that gives users the ability to view the county's points of interest layer, which contains over 750 points that cover everything from schools, hospitals, libraries, rail stations, post offices, on and on. You can also see some population trends here, like age distribution, household information, based on census data. If you zoom out to the full county scale, you'll see that census data at the county level. And if you zoom into a municipality, you'll see it for that specific municipality. Okay, I'm going to do a quick live demo of Parcel Access and Aerial Viewer. But before I do, I think I have an extra minute, so I thought I'd just make a plug for a few other applications that aren't necessarily catered towards conservation planning, but may still be of interest to some of you. The first is moving Dutchess forward. This is our newest application at the county, just opened earlier this year. It's got a lot of great information, including demographics data again, but it also has a lot of transportation data that highlights things like rail station and bus stop locations, congested roadways, areas that have high crash rates. It's, like I said, transportation focused, but it's just a really interesting planning tool that contains a lot of information that can be used for broader planning purposes. So I wanted to mention that one. And then Parks and Trails is a website that shows park locations and the trails within them. It also shows some important features like trail access points, parking areas, kiosk locations, if there's things like ball fields or playgrounds. You can also filter through this website to discover parks that might have interests that align with you. So if you want to see, parks that only have baseball fields or parks that have baseball fields and restrooms, you can do that. It's just an overall great tool for seeing the different recreation lands all in one place. And if you're evaluating a project and you want to see if there are any trails or parks or public nature preserves nearby, this tool might come in handy for that purpose as well. Okay, I am going to hop on over to parcel access. Hopefully everyone can see parcel access now. If you can give me a nod if you can see that.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So again, you can locate a property in a variety of different ways: parcel number, ownership name, or address. I happen to have a lot number that I'm interested in, so I'm going to use that one. And this is going to bring us to the Dutchess County Farm and Home Center out in Washington. When you enter and you click go, it'll zoom you into the parcel that you're interested in. You'll see our most recent aerial imagery defaulted to the background. Of course, you'll see our parcel lines, our lot numbers, and then the acreage of all the sites. Along the right-hand side, you'll see some helpful attribute information. And at the top of the page, you've got some tools that I'll go through and some layers that we can turn on and off. So say, for example, this a project was happening on this parcel and you wanted to take a quick look and see what are there wetlands on this property. Well, we can turn on the wetlands layer at the top and we can see that we've got some green wetlands here. Green is stands for the National Wetlands Institute Inventory wetlands. Blue is the Department of Environmental Conservation wetlands. So it looks like there are no wetlands on this parcel. That's good news. What about flood areas? Let's take a look at that. No flood areas on this property, but one nearby in the back. Let's see what the topography is telling us about this. Let's turn on the terrain. And this sort of makes sense, right? We know that a stream runs through here. We can see that this parcel, the Home and Farm Center, is kind of up on a ledge. It drops off. That's what these contour lines are telling us, into this low-lying area where there's a floodplain. So let's say we wanted to see what the distance was between our back property line and the edge of that floodplain. We can use the measuring tool and we can just do an approximate measurement here. And we can see that we have about a 200-foot buffer. That's good. Okay. Now let's say we wanted to do a snapshot of that. We got to print this out. We're going to do a site visit or something. We can click the print map button. I can, customize what I want it to be called, who the author is, and I can click print. And a pop-up will open that shows everything in a nice format for you. All right. So I also want to show that along the right-hand side in the corner, there is a helpful little link to our historic aerial access. So you can click that and it'll automatically launch you to the same location with all of our different aerial imagery. But for this demonstration, I'm actually going to take a look at a different property. So I'm going to shift us over to another part of the county. This is, of course, the city of Poughkeepsie. I'm interested in this area because this building here is the Poughkeepsie Journal building. That's actually where I'm currently seated. The Department of Planning and Development is located within this building, along with the administrative offices of the Health Department and Veterans Affairs. Across the street, we have the Poughkeepsie City Hall, and then there's the old post office right at the end of the road. So let's take a look at how this area has changed over the time. So again, this is 2020 imagery. I'm going to draw your attention to this area here, this kind of cleared lot, and we'll hop back to 2016 and we'll see that there used to be a building there. This was actually a deli that was cleared just last year. So this imagery captures that. Let's hop back a little bit further and take a look at this back parking lot area. We can see that this parking lot was undergoing some construction. I wonder why, I wonder what used to be there. Let's take a look a little bit further back and see 2000, there used to be a home there that was purchased and cleared to make room for parking lot expansion. We can also see, this is a pretty large building, but if my memory serves me correctly, it wasn't always this big. Let's take a look. Let's hop back to 1990 and look at the back half of this building. It wasn't there. So in the 90s, they did a big expansion to this site. And of course, City Hall here across the street, they were still doing some construction. The paths that used to be in that we saw earlier aren't there now. If we hop back to 1980, we can see that there's the original paths and everything that was there. We can also see that that parking lot is severely a lot smaller in the 80s. There used to be a bunch of homes. Actually, some of these were historic homes that were cleared in the 80s to make room for this parking lot. And then just kind of looking back across the street at the City Hall again, we know that that was built in the 70s because by 1970 it was gone, but we can see that there's still some traces of the historic road that used to cut through this area. And if we hop back all the way to 1936, we can see that there were a lot of homes and smaller structures in this area. The Poughkeepsie Journal building didn't exist yet. The post office didn't exist and City Hall wasn't there. So you can, you could get lost in a rabbit hole with this tool. You can hop down and just click around the county. So that's what I've prepared for you today. Thank you again for coming, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Devin. We do have one question that you might be able to answer. The question asks, aerial viewer updates, what height were they taking at and what resolution did that produce? Do you know that?
I don't know that off the top of my head. We do have that information in our metadata. So every data source, every data that we manage and have at the county, we keep metadata records and a data catalog. I can pull that information and make sure that it gets sent out to participants. Thank you for that question.
Great. Any other questions for Devin? We got maybe another minute. And if not, feel free to, again, throw them in the chat box and Devin can check that out. So there is one more question. What sort of accuracy do the parcel lines have?
They are pretty accurate, but definitely we do have some inconsistencies. You can also see there are certain neighborhoods or certain parts of the county where lot lines are skewed and lot line adjustments have to be made. If you happen to know that maybe it's your personal property or parcel that you're familiar with is not appearing correctly, you can reach out to the Real Property Services Department and work with them to get those accurately represented in our parcel access application. A lot of times people do have the question, is it the tax parcels that are not showing up correctly, or is it the aerial base map that was, that's being geo-referenced underneath it that's not aligning right? It's the parcels, it's not the accuracy of the base maps. So again, if you notice that there's anything inaccurate, reach out to RPT. And I should also just put in a plug that our parcel data is really meant for broad planning purposes and of course for tax purposes. It is not a replacement for a field survey. If you're trying to do any kind of site planning or if a survey is needed, you really do need to work with a hired professional land surveyor.
Great. Thank you so much, Devin. Appreciate it. Again, we'll have some time for questions if there are any more questions for Devin later on. All right. With that, I'd like to introduce our last presenter of the day. Julie, are you all set, ready to go there?
Yes, I am for some reason not able to turn my video on, but can you still hear me?
Yep, can hear you. That's fine. No
Okay,
worries. Great. So Julie Hart is the Senior Manager of Stewardship and Education for Dutchess Land Conservancy and is responsible for overseeing the organization's stewardship and education programs and serves as the resident expert on biology and biodiversity. Julie works on the day-to-day stewardship of DLC's 425 conservation easements and coordinates the DLC's public outreach and education programs with a focus on raising awareness of good land stewardship. Today, Julie is going to talk a bit about the history of land use and conservation in the region and discuss the important role that this plays in local planning efforts. So with that, Julie, I'll turn it on over to you.
Great, thank you, Sean. So as Sean said, I work at the Dutchess Land Conservancy, and I think most of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, I'll give you a quick overview. So we're a small nonprofit land trust. We were founded in 1985 by a group of local citizens who were concerned when a local farm was slated for development. And so from that grassroots beginning, we have grown over the years. And at this point, we've protected almost 45,000 acres of land in Dutchess County, protecting those natural resources for the public, working a lot with farmers and private landowners, as well as with municipalities on land protection. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about scale. This is something we've already covered quite a bit in our presentations that we've seen so far, zooming in and zooming out. And what I want to do is zoom out quite a lot. So far, oh, it's not advancing. There we go. So far we've looked at a lot of lines on a map. And what I want to do is kind of zoom out to the extent where you can't see the lines anymore and think about how did the land get the way it is. Think about the history of the land. We've looked at it in a lot of different ways today. And I want to talk for a while about how the land got the way it is now. So long ago, remember the Ice Age? I'm sure no one personally remembers it, but you probably all know that our land was shaped by glaciation. And so quite some time ago, it's hard to put an exact year on it, but about 10 or 12,000 years ago, the ice sheet was receding. And what was left was rock, basically. So remember, the glacier will scour the land, wipe everything off of it. And as the glacier starts to retreat, soil formation begins. So at this point, you've got a lot of rock, mosses and lichens come in, rocks are gradually broken down through chemical and physical weathering processes, and plants start to arrive. And over time, larger and larger plants arrive, the soils get deeper and deeper, and eventually forests come to dominate the Northeast. And at some point, nobody knows exactly when, but humans arrived in this area. Many tribes, a whole civilization lived here for many thousands of years. The natives called it Turtle Island. That was their name for this place. And in the area of Dutchess County, we know that has a very lengthy history of indigenous habitation. Our area was the traditional lands of the Munsee Lenape. We were in the northern edge of their lands, and the Mohicans as well, who were to the north and east of us. So there's a little bit of overlap in terms of the tribes. And of course, we know that that would have shifted over time. That's just the tribal territories at the time of contact with Europeans, which is what we know. And so these people existed here for many thousands of years. They managed the land in their own way. That's a whole different webinar that we could do that we don't need to get into today. But land management was happening at that time. And then in 1492, as everyone knows, Columbus sailed and reached the Caribbean. And so things started to happen fairly rapidly after that. In 1608, Henry Hudson sailed up the Hudson River. And then as time went by, European colonists arrived and began to clear these extensive forest lands. And over time, the land was cleared to the extent that, you know, there was very little forest left throughout the Northeast. And that was probably the mid-1800s when there was the maximum amount of clearing that had been done. And ever since then, as the farmlands were abandoned, the forests began to regrow, but now we have a lot of invasive species have been introduced and the lands are quite fragmented. So looking at the land at a very broad landscape scale, you can think about the extent of the changes that have happened. And what I really want to drive home with this slide is just how quickly that happened. Remember that time moves differently for different organisms. You know, many insects will live for only days to weeks. Humans live for a number of decades. Trees can live for centuries. And so depending on what form of life you are, you know, those changes happened in a fairly quick time scale. And to the land, of course, those changes happened over about 300 years. And that's the blink of an eye for a landscape. So let's go a little bit more into detail on what happened when the European colonists arrived. So these are some photos of the wonderful dioramas at Harvard Forest that show the land use history of the Northeast in fairly general terms. So this is the forest as it would have, or the landscape as it would have appeared around 1700. So remember, this is about 100 years after Henry Hudson and about 200 years after Columbus. And at this point, the level of settlement by the Europeans isn't enough to cause a lot of changes to the landscape. It would have looked, you know, somewhat different, but not enormously different. But as the colonists came in, you know, their prerogative was to clear the land. That was the goal, and that was why the land grants were given to different folks. You're probably familiar with the 9 partners patent and all those different land grants that kind of designated the lands of this area to certain people. And so colonists arrived, trees were cut down, a lot of them over time. And you can look at the size of this tree that these fellows are cutting up, and you can see that it is a tree that's bigger than most any you'll see on our landscape these days. And so as time went by, clearing is increasing, farming is increasing, and the land use is changing. So from a fairly large forest that was managed by Native Americans, we now have a landscape that is becoming more cleared, and small farmsteads, hardscrabble farming is increasing throughout the Northeast. So now we're into about the middle of the 1700s. And the use of the land is gradually changing. So it's becoming very agrarian in nature. Also use of natural resources. You're probably familiar with the iron industry and the charcoal industry that occurred in this area. And those also made incredible changes to the landscape. You can see a lot of these changes written on our maps in the names of places. You know, think about all of the grist mill lanes and the mill roads that we have, and, you know, the Dover furnace road. So those industries were growing throughout this time. And as a result of that, the land was gradually shifting from a place that had been almost entirely forested to a place that was almost entirely cleared. And so by the middle of the 1800s, you're reaching a time when the majority of the land throughout the Northeast had been cleared. This is what you would have seen. You could stand on a hilltop and not see a tree in any direction except for a few planted around houses here and there. And this is the time of our history when a lot of these stone walls were built. These aren't, they're generally not as old as you think they are. We tend to think they're kind of Revolutionary War relics, but most of these were built in the middle of the 1800s. For a couple of reasons. You know, farmers were needing fences to enclose their lands, either to keep cattle out of their crops or vice versa. And at this point, of course, they had been building fences out of wood, as you normally would, but at this point, they didn't really have a lot of trees left. So between the lack of trees and the enormous quantity of rocks that we have here in the Northeast, building stone walls was a very logical thing to do. And so you find these scattered across the landscape. And again, these were built usually in the 1800s, give or take. Now, over time, these farms were beginning to be abandoned. So by the middle of the 1850s, the land use was starting to shift, and a number of drivers were responsible for that. Again, that could be a whole separate webinar, but I'll highlight three in particular here. First of all, the Industrial Revolution is happening in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And this is driving a lot of people into the cities. People are finding that maybe it would be better to work in a factory than to work on a farm where the soil has so many rocks in it and life is so hard. So a lot of people are migrating from rural farms into cities to get jobs in factories. And also in the early 1800s, the Louisiana Purchase is completed in 1803, which opens up the Midwest. And, you know, people are shocked to find out that there are places in the world where you can stick a shovel in the ground and not hit a rock. And so again, a lot of farmers from the Northeast are migrating out west. And similarly, the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 is another driver of this migration away from the farms of the Northeast. And so over time, these farms are becoming they're becoming abandoned. And so the lands are going back into forests. Trees naturally reproduce and spread themselves across the landscape. It's one of the things that trees do best. And so over time, you see these lands being reclaimed by forests. And by the early 1900s, there's quite a lot more regrowth of forests throughout the Northeast. And so if you think about those 1936 aerials that Devin just showed you, that's roughly the time period here. And so when you look at those for Dutchess County, you can see there is still a lot of land that's cleared for agriculture. The process of regrowing those forests is happening throughout the 1900s. And so here's a Google Earth image of, you know, fairly recent, of Dutchess County and surrounding areas. This is Connecticut off to the east here, Catskills over to the west. And of course, there's the Hudson River in the middle. And a way to sum that up is to look at this wonderful graph, again, from Harvard Forest that shows the forest cover and human population of New England. Unfortunately, they don't count New York as part of New England, so we're not on here, but you can see the general trend. So there's a lot going on here. Let me just break it down for you. The dotted line that starts at the bottom and shoots up is the population, and that is the numbers related to that are on the right side of your screen. And the other lines are all the individual states of New England and the percent forest cover in each of those states. And you can see from 1600 till about 1850, a very steady decline, some precipitous in some states and more gradual in other states, of the forest cover gradually being reduced. And after 1850, you can see the forest cover coming back up again. Those forests are regrowing and regenerating. But I also want you to notice that after 1950, that forest cover starts to decline again. And, you know, data goes up and down, graphs go up and down. That's part of the way the world works. But I just want you to remember the causes of these. So those, oops. So in the earlier times when the forest was declining between 1600 and 1850, that was clearing that was being done for farming. And so when those farmlands were abandoned, the trees could regrow. You know, the soil hadn't been disturbed. But what's happening after 1950 is that the clearing is happening now more for development. And so those forest lands that are being cleared are being taken over by impervious surfaces for the most part. And so those are areas that are not going to be able to regenerate their forests. So this is where you want to take a good look in that rear view mirror and see, you know, the differences in those two different types of clearing, you know, clearing for farming, which allowed for trees to regrow when the farms were abandoned, versus now being cleared more for development and being replaced by impervious surfaces. So an example in Dutchess County, this is a side-by-side showing the same area in southern LaGrange. And on the left side, you can see in 1936, wall-to-wall farmlands for the most part. You can see lots and lots of areas cleared for farming. You know, there's a wetland that looks like it's down here, and roads and houses. But for the most part, you see a lot of farmlands. That's what it looked like in 1936. Contrast with this newer photo showing lots and lots of subdivisions. So this is what I'm showing you with that graph, how these forest lands that grew back are now being cleared for habitation. And so you want to think about those decision makers. When the decisions were being made about how the land was going to be used, decision makers like yourselves really need to consider how the land works and how to maintain the functionality of that land. And so I'm just going to give you a little moment to think about this. Type into the chat if you would. What do all of these things have in common? Anybody see a theme here? What do these all have in common? No. Anybody?
Layers.
Yes, very good. Yes, they all have layers. For anyone who is confused by the chicken, well, chickens are layers, obviously. So, these all have layers. And if you think about the mapping that we've looked at today, there are layers that we're using in our GIS mapping. And so you can put those layers on top of each other and see how they relate to each other, the soil types, the wetlands. But I want to remind you that the land itself has layers, and we often think about the biotic pyramid. And you'll see a lot of different ways to represent this. Here's a couple of examples of it. But generally, you see the soil as the base of the biotic pyramid. And then on top of that are the plants, the primary producers, and then herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, and the apex predators. So that's how we tend to organize our view of the natural world as a pyramid. And with soil always at the base of it. And again, I don't know, we could do a whole webinar on this. If one of the web utilities that is also available, we didn't cover it today, but if you are interested in learning more about soil types, definitely recommend that you look at the USDA's web soil survey. It's a little more complicated than the ones that we looked at today, but it is definitely worth looking into when you're trying to figure out a soil type. Now, why, you may ask, should you care about soils? Aha, don't get me started on that. And as an explanation, I'm going to quote Aldo Leopold, the author of the Sand County Almanac and one of the founding fathers of the science of ecology, who reminds us that land then is not merely soil. It's a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals. And so when you think about all of these different mapping layers that you looked at today, I want to remind you that although sometimes it seems like there's a lot of chaos and disorder in the world, there are patterns that you can see. There are ways of knowing a lot of other things based on one thing. And so to me, knowing a soil type tells you a lot about that land. So for example, a couple different types of soil that occur in Dutchess County: Wayland Silt Loam and Nassau Cardigan Complex. And because I spend a lot of time looking at soils maps, I can tell you a lot about that place just by knowing those soil types. Now, I wouldn't be able to develop a specific species list, but there's a lot that I might know about this just based on knowing those things. So for example, I know that Wayland Silt Loam is a very hydric soil. It's generally found in wetlands. And so I'm pretty sure that topographically that area is going to be relatively flat, whereas Nassau Cardigan Complex tends to be found in more steep rocky places. And because I know that, I can also predict that the Wayland Silt Loam is likely to have something like a freshwater emergent wetland on it, whereas the Nassau Cardigan Complex would have more likely to be an upland hardwood forest. And because I know that, I could predict some of the plants that might occur in those places. And because I know that, I could predict some of the animals that might occur in those places. So again, you're learning, certain things from different layers of the map. And I want to encourage you to link those up and remember that when you know one thing, by extension, you know a lot of things about that land. And that's a good take-home message for this whole training, is to be able to make those connections, to look at these different mapping utilities, be able to put all of this information together and understand the land as a whole landscape, not just at the parcel level, but in the context of the surrounding lands and the connected habitats and ecosystems that it's part of. And so I'm going to leave you with zooming out about as far as any human has ever zoomed out, the famous Earthrise photo from the Apollo 8 mission in 1968. And what Bill Anders, the command module pilot, said afterwards was, "We came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing is that we discovered the Earth." Because that was really what this photo did for people. It reminded them, the Earth is just this little blue ball in this big black expanse of space. And to now bring that back to our own landscape, to just remind you that, sometimes you don't appreciate what's in your own backyard until you look at it from a different perspective. And we're hoping that that's what this training has been able to do for you, is to be able to look at familiar things in new ways. And so with that, I will wrap up. And if anyone has any questions, we can do that. And then we'll head into our breakout groups.
Awesome. Julie, amazing job. Thank you so much. Any questions for Julie? All right. Well, thanks again, Julie. So with that, we have just the last part of our training this morning. We're just going to break out into some small groups just for a few minutes, just to allow you guys to network a little bit, to chat a little bit, and to talk about two kind of overarching concepts. So I'm just going to pull up, share my screen real quick here. Great. So what we hope you guys will discuss a little bit. So looking at these tools that we've talked about today, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with them, do you use these tools, in your day-to-day work? If so, how do you do that? If not, what applications might you see for them in your work now that you know a little bit more about them? And then also, what other mapping resources or tools do you use, that maybe we didn't discuss today that you want to share with the group and make us aware of? Or if there are gaps that you see, where tools could come in handy, what might those be? So with that, I'm going to place everyone in groups here. Bear with me for a second. All right. So, all right, I'm going to put everyone into rooms, and again, I will share those two kind of questions, and we'll have about 5 or 6 minutes to discuss that. So we'll see everyone then. Thanks. All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope that was a useful 5 or so minutes. Hope everyone got to meet someone new maybe and talk about some projects that they're working on in their own municipality or their own organization. So I'm wondering, based on these discussions, if anyone wants to volunteer, maybe some points that you discussed in your group,
I'll volunteer.
Yeah, go ahead, Judith.
We talked about how many resources there are that we didn't, that were not previously available, how an enormous depth. But then the issue is, how do you get that across to your zoning boards and planning boards and to the public so that they'll want to protect areas that can't be regained once they're lost? And we talked about formulating publicity and using the local newspapers, getting 1 or 2 really powerful photos, coming up with a narrative that really makes it dramatic, and getting it out to the papers.
Yeah.
That's been very, very effective for us up here in the town of Rochester. It's helped us enormously.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Nate talked about that a little bit in his presentation. I think it was the town of Phillipstown who did similarly, and got some good PR out through their local newspaper. So yeah, it's definitely a great approach.
We have a creature cam initiative going, and just one single photo in the local paper of footprints in the snow going through an underpass that connects the Gunks and the Catskill Preserve. Oh my God, we had like 20 people volunteering their cameras.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Judith.
If I can add a shameless plug to that, getting to education, a lot of times with especially some of the regulatory approaches that come from these data, or that the data can use to inform, it's difficult to communicate what those mechanisms actually are. And so I'm sharing in the chat. Our program just created a new website, not through the DEC, but through our Cornell, I'm an employee of Cornell, through our Cornell website, and it has all kinds of information on inventorying, on municipal regulatory approaches, planning. It's supposed to be kind of like a one-stop shop for municipalities to access and find examples of other communities doing this kind of work. So I encourage you to visit it and share it and check it out.
Great. Thanks, Nate. Any other conversations of note from the breakout groups? Any data gaps that people discussed? Any tools that groups discussed that we thought could be useful that they're not aware of already? Or other utilities for some of these do exist? All right. If not, that's okay too. We did have one other question that maybe one of the panelists could answer. The question was talking about how these resources have been used in town comprehensive plans, since it's those plans that tend to have the closest link to town zoning and planning.
I can try to answer that question as well. I was talking about how like a lot of this data can feed into natural resources inventories as kind of the repository or collection of that. And we often recommend communities amend their comprehensive plan and add an appendix of that natural resources inventory if you have it, or any kind of relevant report. If you just have a Hudsonia habitat map, and I say just loosely because they're amazing resources, if you amend that into the comprehensive plan, that can kind of help bring those features to light. There's some question of whether or not recommendations in your natural resources inventory would give, or habitat map would have the authority that like a comprehensive plan has, but it at least, brings that into the conversation and makes it part of the community's articulation of their values.
I mean, if I could ask to follow that up, I get a little despondent about the disconnect between our comprehensive plan and our actual zoning and planning legal documents. We're very reactive, just dealing with variances and subdivisions. I mean, are there towns that you can hold up as particularly exemplary in terms of translating natural resource inventories into innovative zoning and planning?
Yeah, I actually do have a few examples of that. Right now, we're working with a slate of communities that created natural resources inventories to help them use that data to create critical environmental areas. And again, these are kind of flags that come up in the secret process that bring attention to the planning board specific resources, and then the planning board's required to address how projects in that area that are part of the secret process will affect that resource. So that's a pretty low bar. I mean, they can say whatever they want really, and it's not, the DEC is not going to kind of enforce it for them. But that's kind of something that communities can do pretty easily. It's not a huge lift to get one of those approved if there's support for that in the community. Another big example is the Community Preservation Fund project. So recently, Ulster County was added to a slate of other communities. Red Hook is the one that stands out in Dutchess County, where they imposed a real estate transfer tax up to 2% on all real estate transfers, and that goes into a fund, and that fund can be spent on purchases. And we have the town of New Paltz, which, surprised that they're at the forefront of this. They use their NRI to help them create their list of eligible parcels for that program, and then they ended up passing it. So, all of the data that was reflected in that and some public input is ultimately going into the prioritization, or went into the prioritization of properties that are going to become conserved. And Red Hook did a similar process. They didn't have a natural resources inventory as a formal document, but they collected natural resources and created kind of an informal one to guide their process there. So those are just two examples, and I'd be happy to talk about more. The website that I just shared has a lot of case studies that kind of look at that and how NRIs inform those things.
Thank you.
Any other questions for our presenters while we have them here? Hey, just want to note, I did share an evaluation link in the chat box. Again, it's very helpful if you can take a few minutes to fill those out. It really helps us at CCE to cater our programming to you all and to make sure that we're putting out high quality programs like this. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for taking a couple hours out of your weekend morning. And I really want to thank Nate, Devin, and Julie for their fantastic presentations and for being here with us as well. So with that, hope everyone has a great rest of their weekend, and I will send out these resources and the video recording to this email list as well. So thank you very much, and hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Very good program.
Great, thank you.
Especially like the fact that it's recorded and you go back to it.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. Thanks,
Fabulous
Jim.
job, guys. Fabulous.
Thank you,
job.
Richard. Appreciate it. Okay. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.